possible to be present in multiple places at once, taking 20 minutes to just focus on one thing is okay. Hi, hello, and welcome back. Today, talking about cells. Something I know that you are probably intimately familiar with. We're going to be talking about cells with reference specifically to the body. Is that showing up right? Yes. Okay, cells. I feel like this slide is very boring. Cells. I left it white because I wanted to be able to draw, and on the dark, I was afraid that wasn't going to show up. Organization of the body. We know we've been talking about atoms and biomolecules. Moving up to a higher level, we get to cells, and that's going to be our focus today. Cells, as you probably know, form tissues, which form organs, which form organ systems, which will be the major focus of the rest of the semester is the organ systems. But we have to get our foundation in place. What's really cool, we'll talk about this more in the reproductive system, but we start out our life as one cell. Just one. You guys, one cell. Your body is made up of 70 trillion cells in adulthood. We start out as one, which is really extraordinary. And the body goes through rapid mitotic division, which I'm sure you learned about in intro bio, and you will learn about a lot more in genetics. But we get up to 70 trillion cells. And we're going to learn a lot about these very super cool specialized cells. We have neuron cells, which we're going to learn all about. You're going to get to create a neuron. You've got fat cells, where you have the nucleus out here pushed out to the very, very edge, because you've got all that fat stored in there. Here, our nucleus is kind of there, and then the cell doesn't even look like a cell anymore, right? A smooth muscle cell. All these cells, they look so different. Another thing that's wicked cool is that of our 70 trillion cells, 40 trillion of those are bacteria. So you are walking around with more bacteria in your body than you are human cells. Wicked cool. Of our personal cells that actually belong to our body, there are 200 plus distinguishable types of cells. And as usual in a general physiology class, we're just going to kind of get to do an overview. The cool thing, again, I'm using the word cool a lot because I'm so cool. The major structures in each of these cells are still primarily shared. You're probably very familiar with the anatomy of a cell, having done this multiple times in multiple classes. We're not going to belabor the point, but we are going to talk about a couple of structures and places that I just want to reemphasize for you. The cell membrane, the glories of the cell membrane. We're going to spend a lot of time here, and we're going to come back to this often. But as we've talked about in the last lecture, the cell membrane is made up of these beautiful phospholipid molecules. And the awesome thing about the phospholipid molecules is that they are both hydrophilic and hydrophobic. So the head is polar and it is hydrophilic. The tails are hydrophobic. And so what happens just naturally is that these form a layer. They form a bilayer. And this is what makes your cells. Some people, I don't remember, I feel like they were physicists, did an experiment where they put in all the conditions that were necessary for a cell. And I feel like them telling this story, I don't even know what I'm talking about. I used to know it really well, but they like shocked it or something. And the phospholipids spontaneously formed bilayers. They spontaneously formed like basically little cells, which is just wicked cool. So we have the cell membrane, we have the phospholipid bilayer, which is the thing that you have probably heard since forever, right? So 2 layers of phospholipids. That's not where the cell membrane stops, though. That's really important structure. But we're going to talk probably a lot more about these guys. So embedded, crossing that membrane, you have proteins. I think I spelled it right. I almost always spell it wrong. You have proteins crossing that membrane, and those proteins are absolutely critical for communication, because that cell can't just be cut off from the rest of the body. It has to be able to communicate. It's making stuff that the body needs, right? Or it needs to respond in a way depending on what's going on with the body, and the proteins are what do that. So here you can see, if we're talking about what the cell membrane does, regulation of exchange, communication, and structural support, those are all proteins. And then the phospholipid bilayer, also critical, but probably the focus of previous studies or previous discussions. That's obviously lipids, right? Phospholipid bilayer. Proteins, however, are critical to all of these functions of the cell, and we're going to get to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. That's the membrane. Then in the cytosol, so kind of the everything else part of the cell except for the nucleus, we're going to talk about just a couple of things. So the cytosol makes up about 55% of the cell. And this is where a lot of the chemical reactions occur that we talked about in our previous lecture. And of course, this is where our organelles are, which was probably the focus of previous studies of the cell. So you are likely very familiar with the organelles. If you're not, go ahead and review that. They're all listed here on the slide, but I am just going to touch on a couple of them. The site of protein synthesis. Does it say on here? Yes, it does. So the organelle that's the site of protein synthesis is the ribosome. So if you guys remember in our last lecture, I talked about the central dogma, right? We start with DNA, and then we go to RNA, and then we go to what? Protein. And all of this happens in the nucleus. Whereas this gorgeousness right here happens in the cytosol. And where does it happen? Boom, at the ribosome. That's important. The cytoskeleton, the reason I'm emphasizing the cytoskeleton is because typically it's just not even talked about. But it's really important. The cytoskeleton is cellular structure. It's what provides the cell with its structure. We tend to think of cells as just a glob, like a balloon. But they have their own structure, and it's provided by the cytoskeleton. The cytoskeleton is wicked cool, and you'll learn more about it in genetics. But I'm going to talk just specifically about one of the types of the cytoskeleton, and that is the microfilaments. Microfilaments are the thinnest elements. They're made up of something called actin, which you're going to hear more about when we talk about muscle. But actin also makes up microfilaments. So you'll find that there's consistencies throughout the body, of course. You find them at the edge of the cell, so that's what this image is showing you here. Why do I care? Why does it matter? Because these structures right here, sticking up out of the cell, those are microvilli. Those microvilli are going to be important in so many different systems that we talk about. They're important in the sensory systems. They're important in digestive tract. They're important in respiratory. And the movement of the microvilli is facilitated by these microfilaments, and these microfilaments are part of the cytoskeleton. Last but certainly not least, the nucleus. The nucleus, we know what's in here, right? DNA. DNA is housed in the nucleus, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Will I talk about that in a minute? Yeah. DNA is housed in the nucleus, and as I pointed out earlier, DNA doesn't come out of the nucleus. DNA goes through is transcribed, and then translation happens outside of the nucleus. Another important thing that's often not talked about with the nucleus is that the nucleus has its own membrane. If you look at this image, this sort of yellow there, can you zoom in? Yeah. That sort of yellow line there, that's showing you that the nucleus has its own nuclear membrane. And embedded in the nuclear membrane are these pores. And that is how the RNA gets out of the nucleus. And it has to have all sorts of stuff on it. It checks and balances that you'll learn about in genetics. But the nucleus has its own membrane. Okay, so gene expression. DNA is in the nucleus. As I said, transcription happens inside the nucleus. RNA leaves the nucleus, and then translation occurs at the ribosomes. Why am I emphasizing this? Well, one, because I'm a geneticist. Two, because this process is going to be very important when we start talking about hormones. Because some hormones are fast acting and some hormones are slow acting. And so some of the hormones, what happens is, in order to get their action to happen, they go and they tell the DNA, hey, do something. Then the DNA has to be transcribed. Then it has to be translated. And then the protein's ready to do something. So this transcription translation thing is going to be important later. All right, that's it for the cell. Next, we will talk about the different, super briefly, do an overview of the tissues of the body.